All right, Dogmeat. Come on in, boy. I feel like this is a pretty safe place to hole up. Oh, all right, boy. How about just right over here? Oh, come on, fella. Oh, come on, you're good. Oh, best boy. Oh, hi, everyone. Hey, I know I haven't been around the channel much lately, but as you can see, the boy and I have been kind of wandering the Commonwealth, trying to find what we can find. But now that I've got you here, why don't we talk a little bit about science fiction, post-apocalyptic science fiction, the kind of science fiction that, I don't know, might have inspired a certain popular TV show that a bunch of us have been enjoying lately? Hey, boy, why don't you go and maybe hunt us up something for supper while I talk to the folks? All right.
What good is worrying when skies are gray? Tomorrow's bound to bring another day. Although your troubles hide the sunny side from view, that doesn't mean to say a happy day is not awaiting you.
Stories about the apocalypse and what might come after have been with us, well, it seems like always. And there are many ways for the world to end in speculative fiction. Plague, climate disaster, alien invasion, everybody turning into zombies. But for this episode, I wanted to focus on some classic examples of one particular apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic scenario seen in both science fiction as well as mainstream literary fiction since at least the end of World War II. And that, of course, is nuclear war. And let me just say at the outset, this list is absolutely not comprehensive. In fact, every single title I'll be talking about comes from the 1950s. It's just representative. Now, I'll be looking at one short story plus 7 novels. And I can't say I recommend them all, honestly, though this video is meant to be more of a discussion rather than my usual style of review content, but all these stories serve in their own ways as examples of how speculative authors were dealing with a relatively new cultural anxiety at a particular moment in history. Some of these stories are extremely famous, while others are far more obscure. But most of them would go on to influence writers, filmmakers, game developers, all the way until the present day. And I'm going to be including chapter stops in this video because it could run a little long and you might want to watch it at your own pace. And besides, sometimes, Dogmeat takes a sweet time when he goes out hunting. So, here we go.
Don't know the time, day or the season, I just know that I'm losing my reason. I've fallen in love, since I'm in love I'm up in the clouds.
Starting with an extremely obscure short story by a famous author. Robert Bloch is considered a legend in the horror field. He wrote Psycho, he wrote some Cthulhu Mythos stories, but I've never been that impressed by what little of his science fiction I've read. DAYBROKE is a story he published in 1958, and a hat tip to Joaquin Boaz, who runs the incredible blog Science Fiction Ruminations, for bringing this one to my attention. It's not a particularly great story, but it is a savage critique of American materialism and hubris couched in an apocalyptic narrative, which makes it a pretty interesting time capsule, and I'll link to it down below. The protagonist is this unnamed survivalist dude who was apparently the only person with the foresight to build himself a bomb shelter on a mountaintop, which seems counterintuitive. Now, after the bomb falls, right in the middle of a TV commercial for laxatives, our hero decides to put on his radiation suit and walk down to the nearby city to see the damage for himself. Now, what follows is a grisly and often surreal walking tour through destruction, which allows Bloch to roast the shallow materialism of mid-century middle-class American culture, in which a person's value was determined by what cars they drove and how modern their homes were. Consumer products and celebrity magazines litter the streets outside demolished shops. A woman with a broom sweeps up piles of now worthless cash outside a bank vault. A dead stockbroker sits mummified at his desk, surrounded by ticker tape. A woman lies dead on a public library steps, still carrying her latest checkouts in a tote bag. At least she had her priorities straight. Everywhere the message is repeated. Look, here are the things we take for granted every day in our cozy suburban lives. It could all go up in a fireball without warning. Now, some of the imagery takes full advantage of Bloch's horror credentials, such as an artist's studio where the explosion has splattered the artist himself all over the blank canvas he was getting ready to start. So he becomes his own final work, which is nasty, but also kind of metal. Anyway, Bloch keeps all of this up until the story's last line, which hits us like a blunt instrument with the insanity of Cold War brinkmanship and the delusion of the nuclear deterrent. Bloch's prose is extremely detached, which admittedly makes some of his graphic imagery a lot more shocking, but this is less of a story than a polemic. The character we follow isn't even a character, just a pair of eyes, through which we are treated to Bloch's nightmare visions. But, as I said, it is interesting in a historic context. And for Fallout fans, the act of trudging for hours through ruined cities will feel like a familiar experience. Now, there are several other notable old short stories and novellas set in a post-nuclear world, of course, such as Roger Zelazny's Damnation Alley, which was both a novella and a novel, and then the cringiest science fiction movie of the entire 1970s, which is kind of impressive when you consider the competition. But that's a story that does its own thing with its setting, and it deserves its own video outside of this one, and it will get one soon. But now I would like to move on to some novels.
Trouble on my hands, no, I did wrong, seeking other lands where I don't belong, no matter...
The earliest of the books on my list here is probably also the most grimdark of the bunch. Wilson Tucker, a very influential and well-liked professional as well as fan writer in the field, isn't all that well known today, but in his heyday he was credited with coining the term space opera, as well as popularizing the practice of putting his real-life friends into his stories as characters, which today is still called Tuckerizing. But despite being an all-around friendly guy, usually the life of the party in a consuite, and yes, I did meet him as a very young teenage fan going to my very first cons, his 1952 book, The Long Loud Silence, has got to be the darkest post-apocalyptic novel published prior to Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and anyone who has read Tucker's novel will not hesitate to compare the two. There you go, Dogmeat, get 'em! For all its heaviness, it was very well received, ranking second place in the Best Novel category for the very first Hugo Awards. It's the story of Russell Gary, an Army corporal and World War II veteran who wakes up after a 30th birthday party drinking binge to discover the entire eastern seaboard has been both nuked and subjected to biowarfare by an unknown enemy. Now, the Army has drawn a hard border at the Mississippi River, quarantining the entire country to the east and imposing martial law on the west. Trapped on the wrong side of the line, Gary first tries to rejoin his unit, and when that fails, he has to find a way to stay alive in this new nightmare world. Gary is already a man of dubious moral character when we meet him, and Tucker lets us watch as circumstances make him harder, meaner, and more ruthless as the rest of the book spans 20 years of increasingly brutal survival. Now, this is an ugly, violent, misogynistic, and desperate world where the better angels of our nature are nowhere in evidence and no one sets out to rebuild what was destroyed. Now, it's a hard book to get a copy of, and, to be honest, I'm not so eager to recommend that most of you should put in the effort. Not because it's bad. I mean, after all, a book doesn't have to be all sweetness and light to have artistic merit, but seriously, if your reading diet consists of Travis Baldree and TJ Klune, a story like this might send you straight to the hospital. The Long Loud Silence is best appreciated in its historical frame, a post-war warning, not just about the bomb, but about the overall moral fiber of the kind of world that could allow such apocalyptic destructive power to be created in the first place.
I'll be seeing my baby tomorrow. Tomorrow, the day after today.
Moving on. A lot of people tend to conflate post-apocalypse stories with dystopias. Now, there is a lot of overlap, and there are, of course, many stories where a dystopian future has an apocalyptic origin. But an apocalypse isn't necessary for a dystopian setting. And the term dystopia, of course, implies a functioning society, not simply a ruined wasteland. It's just a society functioning in the service of evil, led by evil people, who believe they're righteous and good. Leigh Brackett's The Long Tomorrow is set in a post-nuclear dystopia, a future where the technology of the pre-war world is now banned, as is the reconstruction of its old cities. A new constitutional amendment strictly limits population growth. The book is a coming-of-age story about two teenage boys living in a Mennonite religious community who managed to get their hands on an old radio, originally in the possession of a trader who was stoned to death for having it. The boys ultimately run away from their home to a place called Barterstown, which is rumored to be full of forbidden technology. With this novel, Leigh Brackett became the first woman shortlisted for the Best Novel Hugo. And Nicola Griffith, the author of books like Hild and Ammonite, describes it as, quote, a brilliant piece of work and, quote, an amazing leap forward for the genre.
That's why I'm always thinking. I'm thinking, dear, of you.
The CHRYSALIDS by famed British author John Wyndham, best known for The Midwich Cuckoos and The Day of the Triffids, is another tale of religious dystopia set many generations after a global thermonuclear war. Now, in The CHRYSALIDS, Wyndham employs some slightly paranormal elements in a story that is presumably all about bigotry, intolerance, and the fear you live under when you have to hide your true self, living in a society that has been taught your very existence is monstrous. Who could relate to that? Yeah, this sounds like a forever timely theme. Indeed, the parallels to much of the world's present-day pivot towards fascism is alarming. But Wyndham, tragically, undermines himself at the climax. Still, the story has some unforgettably powerful moments when it's actually working. Taking place a couple of millennia after a global catastrophe called the Tribulation, the story is set in a farming community called Wacknook, a harsh theocracy in which breeding true is the most important virtue. Even the slightest physical deformity in people as well as livestock is seen as blasphemous to God's design. One of the most chilling scenes in the book, which is powerful because it is written in such a quiet and understated way, involves a woman pleading for the life of her baby. We're not told what the baby's deformity is, only that its mother tries to dismiss it as such a little thing. But there are no little things to dogmatic people whose hearts and minds are encased in stone. But our young heroes, teenagers David, Rosalind, and their cousin Petra, have their own secret. They and several other kids are telepathic. And Petra's telepathy is so powerful that she's able to contact an entire society of telepaths living all the way in New Zealand. Now, ultimately, the kids are found out and have to flee Wacknook for the fringes outside the community, with a Wacknook army in hot pursuit. Now, there is a lot to admire in this book, and the way in which it is a precursor to a lot of the YA dystopias of the present day cannot be overlooked. It's still extremely exciting and powerful 70 years after it came out. Which is why the ending, which I won't spoil, but which does have the effect of entirely upending and even negating the story's theme about the evils of marginalizing groups of people who are different and then targeting them for hatred and violence on the basis that their difference makes them inferior to you, was just crushing to me. But up until the end, the CHRYSALIDS has a tremendous amount of dramatic power, and I do acknowledge that my take is very much a minority opinion, although I'm confident it is an opinion supported by the text. Back in the days of my legacy website, I never got more hate comments about a review than I did for this book, particularly among British readers who seem to hold Wyndham in the same regard as a lot of American science fiction fans held Heinlein or Clarke. And among them, the CHRYSALIDS is hailed as Wyndham's greatest achievement. So by all means, make up your own mind.
Will you remember this day when we were happy?
On the Beach by Nevil Shute is a novel written and published for the mainstream market. And it's easy to see why, as it is a character-driven piece that doesn't really pay much regard to the science. Although, to be fair, Shute was working with the best knowledge of a possible post-nuclear scenario available to him in the 1950s. Thematically, it is the polar opposite of the long, loud silence. Now, while Wilson Tucker showed the human race going totally feral, Shute depicts his characters going rather peacefully into that good night. The book could even be called a cozy catastrophe, a term Brian Aldiss coined to roast John Wyndham. But the book was enormously popular. It became a classic movie starring Gregory Peck and the legendary dancer Fred Astaire in his first dramatic role, and it has never gone out of print. It describes the last days of a community of people in Australia who are just waiting it out as the inescapable radioactive fallout from a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere makes its way down to them. Now, today, scientists know that things wouldn't quite work that way. Fallout isn't like this giant looming death cloud from Mordor that slowly blankets the Earth until everything it touches has died. People would survive, although their lives would certainly suck. And of course, in the 1950s, nuclear winter was not yet a concept. But what Nevil Shute wants to do is tell a story about a group of people and how each of them copes with the reality of their impending death. The theme here is that life is precious, and while some of what goes on might seem soapy, right, like the romance between two of the leads, Shute never resorts to, Spielberg-style melodramatic button mashing, right? None of the characters spends time feeling sorry for themselves. Now, some of them are wrestling with denial, planting gardens for a spring they'll never see, or taking classes for skills that they'll never use, but the story is impactful for how quiet and reflective it is in its best moments. I mean, if you knew that you only had a short time left, how would you spend it?
I'll pray for you at the end of the day.
Moving on to a Hugo-winning epic that is widely considered to this day to be one of the pinnacles of the genre, and a book that steered science fiction towards higher literary standards. Walter M. Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz spans several thousand years of humanity's future following nuclear war. It's told over the course of 3 novella-length parts. Miller himself, in contrast to the image of most SF writers as staunchly anti-religion, converted to Catholicism after World War II, from which he carried lifelong PTSD that eventually led to his death by his own hand. This novel, in part, is an expiation of his guilt in taking part in the bombing of an ancient Benedictine monastery that had become strategically important to the Nazis. Each part of the book spans a separate time period. The first one sets the scene in a post-nuclear future where all science and technology is hated and feared and consigned to the flames. But a monastic order has arisen named after a post-war scientist named Leibowitz, who rescued as many scientific texts as possible, copying them for future generations in the same way that medieval monks and scribes copied ancient texts to preserve them. The book opens with a young novice named Francis encountering a figure rather not subtly meant to be the Wandering Jew, a figure of legend said to have mocked Christ at his crucifixion, and who is now cursed to walk the earth until his return. Now, this figure leads Francis to a bomb shelter full of previously undiscovered documents written by Leibowitz. The middle section of the book forwards us to a period when scientists and scholars are no longer feared, and the monks have revived some basic technology, starting with reinventing the light bulb. The final section shoots us into the far future, with humanity in a starfaring civilization beyond any technological advancement previously achieved. But we've also brought our own worst impulses and our refusal to learn from past mistakes into the future. And as the threat of another nuclear war is impending, the Church decides to transport its relics and its knowledge to colonies on other worlds. Readers today, with the expectations they have of fiction, might have a hard time warming up to this book. Much of it has those it's a product of its time qualities, right? Such as the almost complete absence of female characters. But all the characters are less important to Miller than his philosophical ideas, and much of the story is played out in dialogue exchanges, not action. But at its best, it's a book that is richly rewarding and inspiring despite an overall pessimism about the human condition, choosing to focus on how individuals can work to overcome humanity's ideological evils.
Soldiers of underground Poland, onwards to battle to fight.
Moving on, for those of you who enjoy the vault sequences of Fallout, and the idea of a group of deluded and indoctrinated people living in what they considered safety and seclusion, unaware that there are hidden agendas in play, well, here is another hard-to-find late 1950s story that in this case is actually worth the effort. Mordecai Roshwald was a Polish writer who only published 2 novels, but if I had to choose, such shop-worn classics as Brave New World and delete them from high school reading lists all over America, I would not hesitate to replace that one with the far superior Level 7. It's about a group of people, and we do not know which side they're on, living thousands of feet underground in a multi-level vault. Now, our narrator is known only as X-127, and as we follow his journal entries, we learn about the bizarre reality they all inhabit, in which their main objective is to be kept alive to launch a nuclear counterstrike in retaliation for a possible first strike. X-127 and his fellow vault dwellers have been chosen for precisely the lack of empathy it would require to be able to push a button that will annihilate entire continents. Roshwald wants to present his readers with the conundrum of how much connection we should feel towards characters lacking the ability to form human meaningful connection. The book is fascinating, often satirical, occasionally hilariously weird in its take on the dehumanizing madness of nuclear war and the idea that such a cataclysm would even be winnable. I mean, after all, what's the point of humanity's survival if the only survivors are the ones with very little in the way of humanity?
Stop, listen to my philosophy, try it, and I'm sure that you can see why everyone always ought to be cheerful. There's no...
And last, but by no means least, speaking of assigned reading in school, Pat Frank's Alas, Babylon was assigned to us when I was in high school English class. I guess that's one of the things that toughened up all us Gen X kids. A lot of our favorite pop songs were about nuclear Armageddon, and our required reading was too. Now, I can be a lot more brief about this one because it's a book that covers the same thematic ground as most of the ones that I've already talked about. There's a nuclear war, and we see its effects on regular folks as they try to survive and keep it together in the aftermath. Now here, our characters inhabit a small Florida town. But Pat Frank brings his credentials as both a journalist and government consultant to bear in making this story as realistic as he could imagine it. Our characters endure the initial chaos and confusion and try to find out the fate of the nation, as well as friends and loved ones around the rest of the U.S. and the world. Now, this gives Pat Frank an opportunity to go into a lot of detail about the global political scene, while our band of intrepid Floridians form a local peacekeeping force to protect themselves from looters and bandits, while others organize to find alternative food sources. I remember this book being pretty compelling and sobering, although in the end, the assigned reading that really impacted me as a high schooler was To Kill a Mockingbird. But I can see myself, revisiting Alas, Babylon in the future, if only to see how it holds up and whether it's more than just another artifact of its time. And with that, I'm going to have to say that's all I have time for in this episode of SFF180. It's starting to get kind of dark. The ghouls are going to be coming out soon, and I think Dogmeat should be back any minute with whatever or whoever he has scrounged up for supper. So, As I always say, if you enjoyed watching, please hit that like button, share the video far and wide with all of your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe. If you have not done so, that is how the channel grows. You can also support the channel at my new buymeacoffee.com account, as well as my Patreon, where recruits into Wink's Army get little perks, like occasionally, though, early access to some of my videos, but mostly what I use the Patreon money for is to pay Matt Olson, my brilliantly gifted and talented channel artist, who does all my fantastic thumbnails and things for me. So that additional support is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank all the rest of you for being the very best viewers in all of BookTube. And, well, until I see you next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay away from the rad roaches, and happy reading. Okay, so you promise this is nobody we know. I mean, you know what happened last time.
Stop, listen to my philosophy, try it, and I'm sure that you can see why everyone always ought to be cheerful. There's no reason for apprehension, so give me your complete attention, and I'll surely be glad to mention an earful. Don't mind